Why did no one ever notice her? That question clung to Fanny Green every time she stepped onto the Alpine Precision Academy's range. At 22, she moved like a shadow across the Bavarian morning, carrying rifles heavier than her frame suggested she could, adjusting gear with a precision no one bothered to thank her for. To most, she wasn't a student, wasn't competition, wasn't even worth acknowledgement. She was just the girl who swept brass casings, who logged ammunition, who polished the rifles that others used to earn medals. But what they didn't know was that she had been preparing for this very moment for years. The sun climbed over the jagged peaks, turning the morning frost into a shimmer that made the steel targets gleam in the distance. The air smelled of gunpowder and pine. Around her, voices carried, sharp, confident, dismissive. Men from military families, national teams, generational hunters. They wore the confidence of belonging. Fanny wore silence. Her leather glove creaked as she slid it tight across her palm, a movement so small no one else noticed, but to her it was ritual. Behind the glass armory doors sat weapons worth more than homes, each with its own character. She knew them all better than the shooters who carried them to the firing line. The TAC-50, the Axe-50, the surgeon rifles, they weren't tools to her. They were companions, machines that spoke if you listened closely enough. And she had been listening all her life. At 8 years old, she was already learning how to feel the wind, not by calculation but by instinct. Her grandfather, an old Alpine veteran, had crouched beside her on the damp earth behind his farmhouse. He put a bolt-action rifle into her hands, far too big for her slight frame, and whispered truths about patience, timing, and respect. He taught her that shooting was not about force, but about listening. "The bullet doesn't leave you," he said once, watching her line up the iron sights. "You leave it, and it carries you as far as you dare to believe." Those words never left her. Now, years later, she found herself at Europe's most elite training ground, but not where she was meant to be. During her admission interview, Director had studied her application with disappointment thinly disguised behind courtesy. "Madame Green," he'd said, his Austrian accent rolling heavily across the desk, "perhaps you would be more comfortable in our equipment management program." Comfortable. That word had stung more than insult. He had looked at her 54 frame, her auburn hair slipping from its cap, and saw only fragility. He hadn't seen the hours spent in freezing dawn fields, the long shots across windswept ridges, the competitions she'd won against men twice her size. He hadn't seen the quiet ferocity she carried like a hidden weapon. So she'd nodded politely and accepted invisibility as her disguise. 18 months had passed since that day. To the academy, she was no more than a technician, a name on an inventory sheet. But each night when the students had gone, she returned. Alone, she calibrated rifles under the moonlight. She requisitioned discarded ammunition, tested targets that needed adjustment, and stole hours from the dark. Her shooting journal had grown thick, 400 pages of wind patterns, ballistic curves, atmospheric notes, sketches of custom cheek rests she had fashioned with her own hands. She was building a world no one else could see. That morning, though, something felt different. A current of anticipation ran through the academy like static. Fanny could feel it in the clipped orders of the instructors, in the sudden hush when Director entered the armory. "I need the TAC-50 prepared for today's long-range demonstration," he announced, his tone carrying authority sharpened by years of service. The TAC-50, a monster of a rifle, 30 pounds, chambered for .50 BMG, with a recoil that bruised even seasoned shoulders. Fanny's fingers moved automatically, stripping it open, checking the chamber, inspecting the scope rings. She knew this weapon intimately. She had already placed rounds on steel with it at distances the academy whispered about in legend. From the corner of the room, voices drifted. The Danish champion spoke in awe, bringing in that American sniper, confirmed kills at 1,500 meters. They say he hit on his first shot in Afghanistan. Snide chuckle followed. "Unlike some people here, at least he can handle a real rifle, not just polish them." His eyes slid toward Fanny, lingering with disdain. Her hands never faltered. She cleaned, inspected, loaded. But inside, the comment cut. Not because it was new, it was. She had lived through hundreds like it. What hurt was that he was wrong in a way too deep for her to correct. She could have told him that she'd hit that very target on the far ridge 17 times, alone in the dark. That she had mapped the wind shadows curling through the valley, memorized the shifting microclimates that bent bullets in flight. That she had mastered the beast he mocked her for touching. But to speak that truth was to lose everything. So she remained silent. At 1000 hours, the demonstration began. Students crowded onto the observation deck. Scopes and binoculars trained on the steel plate perched 1,400 meters away. Fanny stood at the back, unseen, the rifle she had prepared now cradled in the arms of Staff Sergeant Jake. He looked the part. 6'2", broad-shouldered, the kind of man who carried the weight of combat like a second skin. When he spoke, even the instructors leaned closer. "At this distance," he said, adjusting the rifle, "you're not just fighting physics. You're fighting the invisible. Wind drift becomes exponential. Thermal currents, powder burn rates, elevation density. You can't muscle your way through it. You need presence, control." The first shot thundered. The echo rolled across the valley like cannon fire. The bullet struck 6 inches wide, adjusted calmly, his voice steady. Wind compensation was off. But Fanny, peering through her small spotting scope, knew it wasn't the wind. It was the hidden thermal gradient that lived in that final 100 meters. A pattern she alone had mapped, alone had learned to bend. The second shot landed closer. The crowd murmured approval. The third scraped the edge of the steel, earning applause, impressive to them, predictable to her. His voice carried across the deck. "Notice the strength required to manage the recoil. This is why extreme-range shooting favors those with physical presence." Fanny swallowed hard. How many times had she heard it? Strength, presence, biology, words that erased her existence before she could even step onto the line. Words that told her she was destined to remain unseen. Yet inside her chest, something refused to die. That night when the academy fell silent, Fanny returned to the range. Her gear fit together in silence, rehearsed and efficient. She unfolded her journal, traced her finger across the lines of data, the maps of wind shifts, the careful scrawls that only she understood. Her first shot cracked through the empty air. 800 meters, a perfect ring. She adjusted, breathing in rhythm with her heartbeat. 1,000 meters, then 1,200. Then the far ridge where steel waited under the moonlight. 1,400 meters. Her body shifted into the unorthodox stance she had created, one that looked wrong to anyone trained by the academy. She didn't fight the rifle's weight. She let it carry her, her smaller frame bending with its recoil rather than against it. She inhaled, exhaled, paused. The report shattered the silence. A beat of waiting. Then ping, clear, sharp, undeniable. Alone under the Bavarian stars, she smiled, not with triumph, with quiet defiance, because out there, unseen, she had just done what they told her she never could. But as she cleaned the rifle, packed her journal away, and walked back toward the dormitory, a question followed her into the night. How much longer could she keep it a secret? Why did it look so tense? That was the first thought that passed through Fanny's mind as she slipped into the back of the briefing room the next morning. Stood at the front, his weathered face set in lines deeper than usual, his hands folded too tightly behind his back. Even his voice, when he began, carried an edge rarely heard inside the academy. "Ladies and," he said, his Austrian accent heavier under pressure, "we have received notice from the International Precision Shooting Federation. In 4 weeks, they will arrive to evaluate this academy. Their assessment will determine whether we maintain our certification as a premier training facility." The room fell into a silence, so sharp Fanny could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. IPSF certification, the lifeblood of the Alpine Precision Academy. Without it, their reputation would collapse. Students wouldn't come, contracts would dry up, the very foundation of their prestige would crumble. Every person in the room knew it. His voice deepened. This evaluation will test every aspect of our operation, students, instructors, and staff. Ballistics calculations, equipment proficiency, maintenance, and yes, live fire demonstrations out to 1,500 meters. Excited murmurs rippled through the students. Fanny felt her pulse quicken. 1,500 meters, exactly the distance she had been preparing for all along, though she had never admitted it to anyone. His hand shot up. Director, will extreme range shots, like the ones attempted yesterday, be part of the evaluation? They will, confirmed. His eyes swept across the room. Only those who demonstrate exceptional skill in every category will be considered for the final assessment. Our reputation depends on it. Fanny gripped her notepad, heart thudding in her chest. She wasn't a student. She wasn't even supposed to be in this room. Yet the words felt aimed at her, as if fate itself had been listening to the secret hours she'd poured into the range. Around her, students whispered strategies, leaned back smugly, muttering, "Maintenance will be easy. Specs and cleaning procedures, that's all it is." His companions chuckled. Fanny nearly laughed aloud. Could barely strip his own rifle without fumbling pins. He didn't understand barrel harmonics or thermal drift or how ammunition lots varied from batch to batch. She did. Every variable, every flaw, every hidden pattern. Maria Santos, sharp and disciplined, added, "Ballistics will be harder. We'll need to review atmosphere corrections, pressure, altitude, humidity. If they test variable conditions, it could catch people off guard." Again, Fanny's throat burned with the urge to speak. Maria relied on memorized charts. Fanny had spent nights mapping microclimates no one even realized existed. She knew how wind curved between the pines, how the morning sun carved invisible thermals above the valley. But to say it now would expose too much. She lowered her eyes and let the conversation pass over her. Later, back in the armory, her duties carried her through rows of rifles that gleamed under the controlled lighting. She polished steel that wasn't hers, ammunition she wasn't meant to fire. But as she moved, a folded memo caught her attention on the director's desk, unremarkable to anyone else. To her, it was a revelation. The IPSF evaluation would not test only students. Support staff, technicians, maintenance specialists, anyone tied to the Academy's operation would be assessed too. Their performance could influence the Academy's overall score. Her hands froze over the paper. A shiver ran down her spine. This was it, the door she had never expected to open. For the first time, her knowledge might matter, not her silence, not her invisibility, her knowledge. But a problem rose immediately, cold and sharp. To show what she truly knew, she would have to reveal how she knew it. The hundreds of hours spent in secret practice, the ammunition she had tested, the rifles she had borrowed under the cover of night. Her journal contained everything, brilliance and betrayal in equal measure. If they read it, they would see her genius. They would also see her crimes. That afternoon, she made a decision. She requested a meeting with. When she entered his office, the air smelled faintly of pipe smoke and leather. Sat stiffly behind his desk, spectacles perched low on his nose. His eyes lifted as she stepped forward with her notes. "Director," she began softly, "I've been reviewing the IPSF criteria. May I make some technical recommendations on equipment preparation?" He raised an eyebrow, but gestured for her to continue. She spoke carefully, outlining ammunition optimization for high-altitude firing, methods for accounting humidity and drag coefficients, subtle barrel harmonics corrections no one else mentioned. She saw his expression shift, first polite, then intrigued, then something closer to unsettled. "Mademoiselle Green," he interrupted finally, "your understanding of these details is more comprehensive than I realized. Where did you acquire this knowledge? She held his gaze, choosing her words with deliberate care. I've studied ballistics extensively, sir, observed every training session. I wanted to provide the best support possible. It was the truth, just not the whole truth. Leaned back, fingers steepled. For a moment, the room was silent except for the tick of the wall clock. Then he said, "Perhaps we've underestimated your value. The IPSF evaluation will demand precision. I would like you to participate in our preparation process." Her breath caught the smallest opening, a door cracked if not yet open. She nodded once. I'd be honored. For the next days, the academy transformed. Students drilled harder, instructors barked louder, schedules stretched into night hours. And for the first time, Fanny wasn't standing in the shadows, had placed her beside the others, assisting with calculations, advising on equipment readiness. Recognition, after 18 months of silence, felt like sunlight on frozen skin, yet sunlight also exposed. During a ballistics review, Maria Santos stumbled on a calculation. The instructor worked the standard formula, but Fanny saw the flaw immediately. She hesitated, then, against instinct, stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said softly, "but I think the humidity correction factor is off. At this elevation, water vapor decreases density more than the tables show." The instructor paused, chalk in midair. He recalculated, his brow furrowed. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You're correct, but this isn't in our standard curriculum. Where did you learn it?" Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Heat crept into her face. "I've been studying advanced texts," she murmured, "to better support the academy." It was believable, barely. But questions had begun. Cornered her during a break. "Green," he said, voice sharp, "you seem to know a lot for someone who's never been on the line. Where exactly are you getting this expertise?" Her pulse quickened. Around them, students slowed their conversations, listening, smirked. "I study theory," Fanny said evenly, "and I observe." "Books don't teach recoil," sneered, "or wind drift at 1,400 meters." Fanny met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "I never claimed to be a competitor. I only want the academy to succeed." But suspicion had rooted itself. That evening, Hans, the instructor overseeing the audit, approached her quietly in the armory. "Mademoiselle Green, I've been reviewing usage logs. Some discrepancies trouble me. Ammunition consumption patterns, equipment checkouts outside of documented hours, maintenance records that suggest intensive firing not tied to training schedules." Her hands stilled over a rifle she was cleaning. Her throat tightened. She forced calm into her voice. "I conduct extensive testing during maintenance, function checks, accuracy verifications." "Standard protocol," repeated, watching her carefully. "But your initiative goes far beyond typical duties." His tone was neutral but the warning clear. The walls were closing in. That night, walking back to her dormitory under a sky heavy with stars, she felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. Recognition had come, but with it, scrutiny. Her secret was no longer safe. Soon someone would uncover everything. The ammunition logs, the rifles fired, the journal filled with data no technician should possess. The question wasn't if. It was when. And when it came, she knew she would have only one chance left, to reveal her truth on her own terms before they ripped it from her hands. Why was he looking at her that way? Hans' eyes lingered too long as he flipped through the thick binder of equipment logs. His tone, though polite, carried the weight of a prosecutor. Fanny stood across the workbench, polishing the bolt of a rifle, though her hands trembled just enough that she hoped he wouldn't notice. "The ammunition records don't add up," he said, voice calm, deliberate. "We show far more rounds expended than the official training logs account for. Someone is using our rifles after hours, extensively." Her heart thudded in her chest, but she kept her gaze fixed on the steel she was cleaning. Maintenance requires live testing. accuracy checks, function runs. I record them as equipment procedures. Lean back slightly. Perhaps, but these patterns suggest not casual testing, but someone conducting detailed precision work, someone training. The word training hung in the air. Fanny forced her expression into neutrality. I wouldn't know about that, sir. But she did. Every line of data in those logs traced back to her. Every discrepancy pointed directly at nights she had spent prone under the stars, her cheek pressed to cold steel, her breathing timed to the rhythm of her heart. She left the armory with her chest burning, the corridors suddenly too narrow, every face a potential accuser. Suspicion was spreading. That afternoon approached, rifle slung over his shoulder. He stopped in front of her, studying her with eyes sharp as glass. "This," he said, tilting the weapon. "It keeps drifting left. The armorer says the mounts are fine. What do you think?" Fanny's throat went dry. She knew this rifle, knew the quirk in its barrel harmonics that made certain ammunition weights deviate just so. She'd spent weeks learning its language in secret, finding the one bullet load that aligned perfectly. If she answered honestly, he'd know she'd shot it. If she didn't, she'd reveal ignorance she didn't have. She chose the middle path. "Try adjusting ammunition weight," she said softly. "Sometimes harmonics favor a specific grain, could correct the deviation." His eyes narrowed. That's a fairly advanced observation for someone who just cleans rifles. Before she could reply, his laugh cut across the air. "Or maybe she's been reading bedtime stories about ballistics. Tell us, Green, what chapter explains recoil management at 1400 meters?" Fanny turned away, jaw tight. Silence was safer than anger, but silence was also surrender, and she felt the sting of it settle into her chest. Later that night, she overheard voices in the storage room. Hands, two instructors she didn't recognize. Their words seeped through the thin wall like poison. "Discrepancies too systematic," was saying. "This isn't sloppy logging, it's deliberate. Someone has been conducting extensive firing sessions." "Students?" one instructor asked. "No," replied, his voice heavy. "The usage patterns don't match. Whoever it is had access during hours when only staff were present. That narrows it significantly." A pause, then a voice Fanny recognized as Carl's father. "You're suggesting the technician. Impossible. She's barely strong enough to lift these rifles." "Nevertheless," said grimly, "the evidence points toward her." Fanny pressed her back against the wall, every word sinking like lead. The secret she had guarded for 3 years was collapsing around her, not through choice, not through triumph, through suspicion. That evening, a formal message appeared on her dormitory desk. "Report to director's office at 900 tomorrow to discuss irregularities in equipment usage." The words blurred as she read them again and again. She wasn't being asked, she was being summoned. For hours she sat at her desk, her shooting journal open in front of her. The pages whispered back the story of her secret life. Wind maps inked in careful hand, equations scratched in pencil, records of shots placed across distances most shooters called impossible. Pages that proved her brilliance and her betrayal. Tomorrow they would strip it all from her. She would leave as a violator, not a visionary. But as midnight approached, another thought rose, quiet, insistent. What if she refused to be judged in silence? What if, before they condemned her, she showed them the truth? Not the logs, not the theories, not even the journal. The shots. The impossible shots. Her hands steadied. Her fear cooled into resolve. If they were going to end her, let it be after they had seen what she could do. She spent the night preparing, not with sleep, but with calculation. She selected the rifles she would use, ammunition loads she had tested in secrecy, targets she would position at distances that no one could dismiss as luck. She packed the custom cheek rests she had shaped, the rounds marked with faint silver ink. And in the deepest part of her plan, she saved one demonstration for last. The one no one would believe until they saw it with their own eyes. The bullet-splitting shot. By dawn, exhaustion pulled at her bones, but her mind burned clear. She closed her journal, bound it with cord, and placed it carefully in her bag. Tomorrow, she would walk into his office not as the quiet technician awaiting judgment, but as the marksman they had refused to see. Why wasn't she trembling? Fanny asked herself that as she stood outside his office the next morning. The corridor smelled faintly of oiled wood and leather polish, and from behind the heavy door came the muted murmur of men's voices. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. Inside it lay her journal. 3 years of stolen hours, of numbers, diagrams, and impossible truths. Her fate rested on whether they saw it as brilliance or betrayal. The door creaked open. His aide nodded. "He'll see you now." She stepped inside. Sat behind his desk, back ramrod straight, his gray hair combed immaculately. Hands was there too, a stack of equipment logs open before him. The room felt colder than it should have. "Mademoiselle Green," began, voice stern but measured. "We've found irregularities, ammunition consumption, unauthorized access, equipment where inconsistent with official records." Fanny kept her chin level. "Yes, sir." "You understand the seriousness of this?" His eyes pinned her. "Such violations could mean expulsion, termination of your role, even blacklisting." She could have bowed her head, could have begged, but she didn't. "I understand," she said softly. "But before you decide, I'd like to show you what those irregularities achieved." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, shifted in his chair. "This is not a negotiation," said firmly. "Policies exist for a reason. You cannot simply—" "What I'm suggesting," Fanny interrupted, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest, "is that the Academy might benefit from understanding what my preparations have made possible, before dismissing them as violations." Silence. The audacity of her words filled the room like smoke. For a moment, only the tick of the wall clock intruded. Then leaned forward, opening her journal where she had placed it on the desk. He scanned a page, brow furrowing, then another, his expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to disbelief. "These calculations, they're not standard. Some of this isn't even published in textbooks. Where did you learn this?" "Here," Fanny said. "Every evening, every empty range session, every hour I wasn't meant to have." Picked up the journal himself. His fingers traced a page filled with environmental maps, arrows marking microclimate patterns across the valley. His weathered face hardened, then softened in something like reluctant awe. 3 years, he asked. She nodded. "Every night." The silence stretched, then exhaled slowly. "Policy violations this severe cannot be ignored, but—" his gaze lifted to hers. "The scope of your preparation is undeniable. What you propose is highly irregular, but perhaps necessary." He closed the journal with a soft thud. "Very well, you'll have one chance, 1 hour on the range. If what you claim is true, we will reconsider. If not, your time here ends." Fanny's chest rose, steadied, fell. "I understand." Word spread through the academy faster than fire on dry grass. The observation deck buzzed with bodies, students, instructors, even the skeptical donors who normally kept their distance. Rumors had twisted the story beyond recognition, that the quiet technician was about to embarrass herself, that was indulging her desperation before dismissal, that the test would end in silence and shame. Fanny ignored them all. She walked to the firing line with her bag slung over her shoulder, each step measured, each movement calm. Her heart beat fast but steady, like a metronome she had learned to obey. She laid out her rifles in careful order. The TRG-42 for the first target, the AX-50 for the second, and the TAC-50, the beast she had already tamed, for the shot that would silence them all. Observed her with folded arms, his expression a blend of doubt and curiosity. Stood nearby, his jaw tight, the weight of the Academy's reputation resting on this strange gamble. Students whispered from the stands, their disbelief thick enough to taste. The air was restless with crosswinds, gusts curling off the ridges like invisible serpents. An instructor muttered, "Conditions are terrible. She won't land a single hit." Fanny heard him, but her lips barely curved. These were exactly the conditions she had studied, exactly the chaos she had learned to turn into order. She dropped into her stance, unorthodox, almost awkward to untrained eyes. Not the wide, muscled prone position the academy. Her frame angled differently, her core doing the work her arms never could. Her cheek rested against the stock with a precision born from hundreds of nights alone. She opened her journal one last time, scanning the lines of data she had prepared for this hour. The numbers weren't just calculations. They were confessions, proof that she had lived in the margins, listened when no one else thought she was listening, built a world in silence. She closed the book, slid the first round into the chamber. The crowd quieted. The shot rang out across the valley. A metallic ping answered half a breath later, dead center at 800 meters. Gasps rippled across the deck, but Fanny was already moving, smooth, efficient, silent. She swapped rifles, settled behind the Axe-50. The second target, 1,200 meters, sat in a tricky crosswind pocket that had more than one seasoned shooter. She inhaled, timed her exhale to her heartbeat. Crack! Another ring of steel. Voices rose, awed, confused. Who had once dismissed her stared through his scope, whispering, "How is she doing this?" But Fanny heard none of it. She was already reaching for the TAC-50. The weapon felt heavy in her arms, but not hostile. She had learned to move with it, not against it. She nestled into her modified position, letting the rifle's recoil become part of her rhythm. 1,400 meters. The shot every student at the academy dreamed of hitting. She steadied her breathing, eyes narrowing on the distant plate. Wind curled and shifted, invisible to everyone else, but not to her. She had mapped it, memorized it, befriended it. She squeezed the trigger. The TAC-50 roared. The echo rolled down the valley like thunder. Then silence, until the clear metallic ring answered, sharp and undeniable. Another perfect hit. The observation deck erupted in disbelief. But Fanny wasn't finished. She reached into her case, pulling out a specialized target stand she had prepared. 2 plates aligned, one in front, one behind. Her final demonstration, the culmination of 3 years in the shadows. Her voice carried clear, steady. "This last shot will prove something different. That precision isn't limited by size, strength, or expectation. That it can be achieved through innovation." She loaded her custom round, modified, designed to fragment with precision. The culmination of science, patience, and faith. Her body settled, her breathing slowed, her focus narrowed to a single point of inevitability. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet cut the air. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The first crack, bullet splitting against the front plate. The second, fragments striking the rear target with perfect accuracy. 2 impacts from one shot. The range fell silent, not a whisper, not a breath, only the echo of impossibility turned fact. Lowered his scope, voice hushed with awe. She split it, at 1,400 meters in crosswinds. She split her bullet. The silence broke into chaos. Instructors muttered equations that made no sense of what they'd seen. Students stared at her as though she were a ghost. Even who had prepared to condemn her whispered, "This isn't just skill. This is innovation. This could change everything." Stepped forward slowly, his face unreadable. He stopped at the firing line, eyes on the woman they had dismissed for so long. "Mademoiselle Green," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "You've challenged assumptions I have held my entire career. What you've demonstrated here was supposed to be impossible." Fanny looked up at him, her face calm despite the storm inside her. "Sometimes," she said softly, Impossible is just what no one bothered to test. Why did no one speak? The shot had already faded into the Bavarian air, yet silence clung to the range as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Fanny lowered the TAC-50, her cheek lifting from the stock, her heartbeat still steady from the rhythm she had forced upon it. The steel plates downrange bore two scars where only one was expected, proof etched in metal. And yet silence. Students stared through scopes with wide eyes. Instructors exchanged quick, unsettled glances. Even who had weathered decades of precision shooting seemed rooted to the ground, his expression unreadable. Finally broke the spell. His voice was hushed, almost reverent. She split the bullet at 1,400 meters. The words spread like sparks through dry brush. She split it. Fragments on target. In this wind. Impossible. The observation deck erupted. Voices overlapped, hands gestured wildly, disbelief battled with awe. Students who had never spoken to Fanny now craned forward, desperate to understand. Instructors muttered equations, their theories collapsing under the weight of what they had just witnessed. But Fanny remained calm. She methodically cleared the rifle, slid the bolt open, and laid it back into its case. Her movements were precise, practiced, grounded. She let the storm rage around her, saying nothing. Silence was her shield, as it had always been. Hand stepped forward, face pale, eyes fixed on the targets. The calculations required, the fragmentation trajectories, atmospheric compensation. This represents innovations far beyond anything in our curriculum. Moved next, his boots crunching against the gravel of the firing line. He stopped in front of her, weathered face shadowed by a mix of amazement and discomfort. For 30 years he had believed in certain truths. Size mattered, strength mattered, tradition mattered. And in one shot she had shattered them all. "Mademoiselle Green," he said at last, his Austrian accent thick with emotion, "what you have shown us today challenges assumptions I have carried my entire career." Fanny met his gaze, calm, quiet, certain. "I only showed what was already possible. No one asked the right questions." The murmurs rose again. Maria Santos stepped forward from the crowd, her voice tremulous but genuine. "How did you develop that technique? Controlled fragmentation. It isn't in any ballistics manual I've ever read." Fanny considered the question. The truth was simple yet heavy. 3 years of observation, hundreds of experiments, thousands of failures. The answers don't live in manuals, they live in patience. Her words settled over the students like frost. Some nodded, others frowned, but all of them listened. For the first time her voice carried weight. But respect came at a cost. That evening, the academy halls buzzed not just with awe, but with unease. Instructors whispered about policy. Some admitted her innovations could revolutionize competitive shooting. Others warned that rewarding such violations would erode discipline. Office lights burned late into the night. Inside, voices argued. "Her achievements are undeniable," insisted. "Her calculations alone exceed graduate-level work. To dismiss this would be to blind ourselves." "And yet," Carl countered, his tone sharp, "rules exist for a reason. If we excuse her, we invite chaos. She was a technician, not a student. She broke trust. We cannot build an academy on exceptions." His voice cut through the debate, weary but firm. "We stand at a crossroads. Do we cling to what we've always believed, or do we adapt to what we've now seen?" Fanny, alone in her dormitory, didn't hear those words. She sat on her bed, journal open across her lap, staring at the pages that had guided her life. She should have felt triumph, vindication. Yet all she felt was the quiet ache of uncertainty. What if they dismissed her anyway? What if this moment, her moment, vanished into politics and pride? Her grandfather's voice returned to her, soft and steady, as if whispered through memory. "The bullet doesn't leave you. You leave it, and it carries you as far as you dared to believe." She traced her finger over the inked equations, the notes scrawled in the margins, the maps of invisible winds. She had carried herself this far. She could not go back. The following morning, she walked through the academy grounds, and for the first time in 18 months, people looked at her differently. Maria Santos caught her eye, offering a small, respectful nod. Even once her harshest skeptic stepped aside to let her pass. But he glared, his jaw tight, his pride wounded. For someone like him, raised on entitlement, her existence was an insult. "Green," he muttered as she passed, "don't think one stunt makes you a shooter. You'll never belong here." Fanny didn't answer. She had learned long ago that dignity didn't argue. Later that day, summoned her again. His office was crowded. Santos, even the American sniper who had stayed behind for extended training, gestured to her journal on the desk. "We have reviewed your documentation, your methods, your innovations. They are remarkable, but your violations are equally serious. Ammunition, rifles, range access. You circumvented every regulation." Fanny stood straight, her hands clasped calmly before her. "I accept responsibility, sir, but I also ask you this: what is more important, rules or results?" The room shifted uneasily, leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of combat experience. "Her bullet-splitting shot represents innovation that could change military doctrine. We spend years training for marginal gains. What she's achieved is a leap. If your academy dismisses her, others won't." Silence followed his words. They hung heavy, undeniable. His jaw tightened. He looked at Fanny, really looked at her, as if seeing her fully for the first time. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the Academy's greatest failure was not in your violations, but in our blindness." Fanny felt her throat tighten, though she gave no outward sign. For 18 months she had been invisible. Now, finally, someone admitted they had failed to see. But the decision wasn't made. Not yet. Politics, pride, reputation all weighed heavily. For the next week, the academy existed in a strange limbo. Students trained harder, instructors lectured longer, but everywhere she walked, eyes followed her. Some with respect, some with suspicion. And at night, when the halls fell silent, she returned to her journal. Not to add new equations, but to write reflections she had never dared before. Not about wind or bullet drift, but about fear, about invisibility, about how silence could wound deeper than words. The IPSF evaluation loomed ever closer, and with it, a chance not only for the academy to prove itself, but for her to prove whether her place was real or just a momentary crack in the wall of dismissal. The night before the evaluators were set to arrive, she stood alone on the observation deck, looking out at the valley where she had spent countless secret nights. The wind tugged at her hair, cold and restless, the same wind that had carried her bullets to impossible places. She whispered into the dark, not to anyone else but to herself. "I won't go back into the shadows, not again." Why did their footsteps sound so heavy? The evaluators arrived on a crisp morning, their convoy rolling through the gates with polished efficiency. Black sedans, tinted windows, foreign plates. The International Precision Shooting Federation had come not as guests, but as judges. They carried no warmth. Their suits were dark, their expressions colder than the alpine wind. Each step they took across the courtyard seemed to echo authority, the kind that could dismantle reputations with a single word. Students lined the balconies, instructors stood stiffly at attention, and himself greeted them with the gravity of a man who knew everything hung in the balance. Fanny watched from the edges, unseen as always, or so she thought, because when the lead evaluator, a tall woman named Doctor, scanned the gathered faces, her eyes lingered on Fanny for a fraction too long, as though she already knew the whispers that had raced ahead of the convoy. "Let us begin," said. Her voice was crisp, precise, like glass cutting through air. The evaluation unfolded in layers: ballistics theory, atmospheric compensation, equipment proficiency. One by one, students stepped forward to be tested, their skills dissected under unflinching eyes. Performed well, his calculations quick, his tone confident. Maria Santos faltered once, misjudging a correction, but recovered. Even, smug as ever, delivered acceptable results. But through it all, a question lingered unspoken in the air. What about her? Rumors had already reached the evaluators. A technician splitting a bullet. Impossible feats performed in silence. But rumors were not evidence. And evidence was all that mattered here. By midday, called a recess. The evaluators conferred quietly at the far end of the range. Students dispersed in tight clusters, whispering speculation. Fanny retreated to the armory, her hands steady as she laid out equipment for the next session. But inside, her chest ached with tension. Would they even allow her to demonstrate? Or would politics suffocate the chance before it began? The door opened behind her, entered followed by Dr. Mademoiselle Green said, his voice formal, the evaluators are aware of your demonstration last week. They request that you repeat it, under controlled conditions, officially. Fanny's heart lurched. His eyes fixed on her with sharp intensity. We have heard extraordinary claims, but claims mean nothing without proof. Do you accept? Fanny looked down at her hands. They were steady, calmer than she expected. Yes, she said simply. Word spread faster than fire. By the time Fanny walked to the firing line, the observation deck was overflowing. Students, instructors, staff, even the kitchen workers had come to see. The evaluators sat in a reserved section, clipboards poised, expressions blank. The targets gleamed in the distance, 800, 1200, 1400 meters. And beyond them, the twin-plate setup himself had authorized for the bullet-splitting shot. The wind was restless, shifting in patterns only she had memorized. A challenge, a risk, but also her ally. She laid out her rifles, the TRG-42, the AX-50, the TAC-50, each one prepared meticulously, every scope calibrated, every round loaded by her own hands. Her journal lay open beside her, but she didn't need it. Every line of data was etched in her memory. The first shot cracked through the valley, ping, center hit at 800. The second thundered, ping, perfect strike at 1200. The third roared like a cannon, ping, direct impact at 1400. The crowd murmured, restless, caught between awe and disbelief. And then the final test. Fanny positioned the TAC-50 for the split shot. She adjusted her stance, her cheek settling into the familiar rest, her body moving with the weapon as though it were an extension of herself. The evaluators leaned forward, their pens poised. The students held their breath. She inhaled, exhaled, found stillness. Crack! The bullet split on the front plate, fragments flying true, striking the rear target with sharp, undeniable rings. Silence. Then murmurs, gasps, disbelief rippling like a tide. Doctor lowered her binoculars slowly. Her face revealed nothing, but her eyes lingered on Fanny with an intensity that carried weight. Stepped forward. Well, he asked, his voice taut with anticipation. Closed her clipboard. We will need to review all technical data, ballistic evidence, equipment analysis, but the demonstration was conclusive. Fanny said nothing. She simply cleared the rifle, closed her journal, and stepped back. The academy buzzed for hours afterward. Some students whispered admiration. Others whispered fear, sneered loudly, insisting it was luck, trickery, manipulation. But no one could erase the sound of steel struck twice by fragments of one bullet. That night, the evaluators held a closed meeting. Their words did not reach the students, but whispers leaked like smoke. Some argued her innovations represented a breakthrough. Others warned that rewarding such defiance would set a dangerous precedent. Fanny sat alone in her dormitory, her journal closed beside her. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt only the quiet weight of waiting. Because recognition was not yet hers. It dangled before her, fragile as glass. And she knew some would rather shatter the glass than let her hold it. Why did they keep her waiting? Fanny sat outside the director's office, the ticking of the hallway clock loud enough to gnaw at her nerves. Beyond the door, the evaluators and the academy staff debated her fate. She imagined the words passing between them: innovation, violation, precedent, risk. Words tossed like knives while she sat in silence. The door finally opened. Emerged, his face heavy with fatigue, followed by Doctor, her expression unreadable. Mademoiselle Green said, "Please come in." She stepped inside. The room was crowded, evaluators on one side, academy instructors on the other. Tension thickened the air. On the table lay her journal, her rifles, logbooks, and fragments of the bullet she had split, collected from the target stand. Evidence of brilliance and of defiance. Spoke first. "Your demonstration was extraordinary. Your calculations and execution suggest years of disciplined study and practice. What you have achieved is, in technical terms, a breakthrough." Her voice paused, cold steel entered it. "But your methods violated every regulation this academy stands on: unauthorized range use, ammunition theft, alteration of equipment. If such behavior is tolerated, what message does that send?" Carl's father seized the opening. "It sends the message that rules are optional, that anyone can ignore protocol if they think themselves exceptional. This academy cannot reward lawlessness." Murmurs of agreement circled the instructor's side of the room. Fanny kept her gaze level. "I broke rules, I admit that. But what I built in silence, I built because there was no place for me in your rules. You saw nothing in me, so you gave me nothing. All I did was refuse to disappear." The room quieted at her words. Hands leaned forward, his voice cautious but firm. "Her work has merit. To deny it is to blind ourselves. This academy exists to advance precision, not to preserve pride." Exhaled, rubbing his temples. His silence spoke of conflict, of loyalty to tradition and duty to truth pulling in opposite directions. Set down her clipboard. "The IPSF will acknowledge her results. That is non-negotiable. But whether this academy chooses to embrace her or exile her, that decision lies with you, Director." The words fell like a gavel. For hours afterward, no decision came. The evaluators to draft their reports. The instructors split into factions. Students speculated wildly, voices filling the mess hall, the dormitories, even the training fields. And through it all, Fanny walked in silence. Some met her with nods of respect, others with glares sharp enough to cut. That evening found her sitting alone on the range, the valley bathed in twilight. He carried no rifle, only his presence. "You changed things," he said quietly. Fanny looked at him, unsure whether it was praise or accusation. "I used to think strength was everything," he continued. "That a rifle belonged only to those who could wrestle it into obedience. But you let the rifle move with you. You listened to it. That's not weakness. That's something else." She searched his face. Sincerity lived there, tangled with humility. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once, then left her to the darkening valley. But not everyone brought kindness. The next morning cornered her outside the armory. His voice was low, bitter. "You embarrassed us. You embarrassed me. My father won't let this stand. You think you'll walk away a hero. No, you'll walk away forgotten." Fanny met his fury with calm. "If being forgotten means I don't bend myself into your version of belonging, then so be it." His eyes narrowed. For the first time, he found no ground to stand on. Days passed. The evaluators drafted their report. The academy braced for its verdict. Students trained harder, aware that every performance might sway the balance. And then one evening summoned her again. She entered his office to find him alone, his face lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp. He gestured for her to sit. "I've spent my life believing discipline meant rigidity," he said quietly. That order meant sameness. I dismissed you before I even knew you. I looked at your size, your silence, and I decided you could not belong. That was my failure, not yours." Fanny said nothing. Her throat was too tight to trust words. Continued. "The IPSF report will recognize your demonstration as legitimate. They will call it unprecedented, but my instructors remain divided. Some say to embrace you is to betray tradition. Others say to dismiss you is to betray truth. And I," he paused, eyes heavy with conflict, "I have yet to decide." She found her voice, quiet but steady. "Decide what you will, Director. My worth doesn't vanish because you deny it. It exists whether you see it or not." He looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is what unsettles me most." That night, alone in her dormitory, she stared at her journal. She had written her life into its pages, every failure, every triumph, every breath of the wind across the valley. Recognition or exile, the truth was already hers. Yet the ache of uncertainty pressed down like a weight. She whispered to the silence, "I showed them, but will they let themselves see?" The IPSF verdict was due in the morning, and with it, the Academy's decision. Her future hung suspended in the air, fragile as a bullet in flight. Why was the courtyard so quiet? Fanny noticed it the moment she stepped outside that morning. Students, instructors, even the kitchen staff, all had gathered, yet no one spoke. The air was heavy with anticipation. At the far end stood Doctor and the other evaluators. A stack of papers rested in his hands. The IPSF verdict. Raised his voice, steady and solemn. "This academy has been assessed in every domain: ballistics theory, equipment maintenance, live fire performance, and the evaluators have issued their findings." He paused, the silence deepening. Doctor stepped forward, her words crisp. "The Alpine Precision Academy retains its certification. Performance standards have been met, but one matter remains exceptional: the demonstration conducted by Mademoiselle Fanny Green." All eyes turned. Fanny felt the weight of every stare press against her, but she kept her shoulders square, her gaze calm. Continued. "Her innovation, though achieved outside of official sanction, represents a documented advance in ballistic practice. Controlled fragmentation at extreme range has not been previously recorded in competitive or operational settings. Our report will reflect this breakthrough." Gasps rippled through the crowd. But her voice sharpened. "At the same time, we cannot ignore the rule violations involved: unauthorized equipment use, ammunition unaccounted for, deception by omission. The IPSF does not adjudicate discipline, that is the Academy's decision. But let there be no doubt, her skill is real, her results are valid, and her work will be remembered." The evaluators stepped back. The decision now belonged to. He looked at her, eyes heavy with conflict. "Mademoiselle Green," he said slowly, "your actions endangered the integrity of this institution, but they also revealed the blindness of our own traditions. You forced us to confront what we refused to see, and for that—" He paused. The courtyard held its breath. "For that you will not be dismissed. You will remain here, not as a technician, not in the shadows, as a competitor." The silence shattered. Murmurs swept through the students, some in awe, some in anger. His face twisted with disbelief. Maria Santos, tears bright in her eyes, clapped once, then again, until applause rippled unevenly across the courtyard. Fanny stood still, her chest tight, her hands trembling at last. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the solitude of her nights. She had rehearsed how she might smile, how she might thank them, how she might finally belong. But when it came, she said nothing. She only bowed her head slightly, dignity radiating through silence. Afterward approached her quietly. "You earned this. No one can take it now." She gave him the faintest of smiles. "They tried to." He nodded. "And you split the bullet anyway." Word of her achievement spread beyond the academy. Articles appeared in ballistics journals. Military observers requested technical briefs. Even competitors from rival academies sent cautious inquiries. But with recognition came shadows. Some whispered that her shot was a trick. Others insisted had staged it to save the academy's certification. And his pride shattered nursed resentment that would never heal. Fanny ignored it all. She had not trained in silence for applause. She had trained because she could not do otherwise. Her first official day as a competitor arrived under a pale alpine dawn. She walked to the firing line not as a shadow but as herself. Students watched. Instructors observed. Even stood in silence, arms crossed, no longer dismissive but wary, as though still adjusting to the new shape of truth. Fanny set her rifle down, her hands moving with the same practiced grace they always had. She inhaled, exhaled, found her rhythm. The shot cracked through the valley, ping, dead center. A small smile touched her lips, not because others saw her now, but because she had always seen herself. That night, alone in her dormitory, she opened her journal one last time. Not to add data, but to write the words that had lived in her heart for years. Recognition is fragile, respect can be, but dignity does not ask permission, it simply acts. She closed the book. For the first time in years, she felt no need to hide it. Sometimes, the world refuses to listen until you force it to hear. Sometimes, the impossible must be done in silence before it can be believed in daylight. And sometimes, dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.